You just hurt the world for real, because she was loved by everybody.
In my heart, I'm still trying to wrap my hands around it.
On an ordinary Tuesday evening in Center Line, Michigan, a quiet residential street turned into the scene of something no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. What started as just another day inside a family home would end with sirens, flashing lights, and a mother of four lying lifeless on her kitchen floor. And at the center of it all was a man she once trusted. Her name was Erica Sanders, 38 years old, a mother, a girlfriend, a woman who, to the outside world, was simply living her life behind closed doors like everyone else. But inside that home, prosecutors say a different story was unfolding, one that would end in gunfire, panic, and a desperate attempt to escape justice. According to authorities, the man she was in a relationship with, 39-year-old Zachary Fuqua, was the one who pulled the trigger. Investigators allege that in a sudden and violent moment inside the house near Van Dyke and Sterling, Erica was shot in the back of the head while children were present in the home. Children who should have never had to witness what came next. And just when it seemed like the nightmare had reached its worst point, it didn't end there. Police say Fuqua didn't stay. He fled the scene, leaving behind chaos and a house that had just been turned into a crime scene. But what makes this case even more chilling is what prosecutors later claimed in court, that as he left, he didn't just run. He allegedly interacted with the children, giving them candy and saying words that now echo through the case like something out of a nightmare. By the time officers tracked him down near 10 Mile and Van Dyke, the situation had already escalated into a full manhunt across two separate locations. And when he was finally taken into custody, investigators began piecing together a timeline that would lead to charges of second-degree murder and multiple weapons felonies. But the question that still hangs over everything is the one that no court filing has fully answered yet. What could possibly lead a moment like this, inside a quiet home, to turn so deadly so fast?
During the hearing, the prosecutor described a brutal killing.
That the defendant had no qualms with shooting his significant other in the back of the head in the presence of three minor children. Moreover, the callousness of such an action, especially as it's alleged that as he left the house, he gave the children candy saying, "Here y'all babies go."
While no motive for the killing was mentioned, Fuqua was so
Tragic. It started, according to investigators, like so many domestic calls do, quiet at first, unclear, the kind of dispatch that doesn't immediately signal the kind of ending it will become. But within minutes, that calm began to collapse. Inside a home on a residential street in Center Line, Michigan, children were present when the first 911 calls came in. Neighbors would later describe the moment differently depending on how close they were, but most agreed on one thing. Something felt wrong before the sirens even arrived. A sudden tension in the air. A disturbance that didn't belong in an otherwise ordinary neighborhood where people usually worry about mail deliveries, school pickups, and evening routines, not gunfire. When officers arrived, they were met with a scene that would immediately shift the call from a domestic disturbance to a homicide investigation. Inside the home, they found Erica Sanders unresponsive. Emergency responders attempted life-saving measures, but it was already too late. The injuries were fatal. A mother of four was gone inside the walls of her own home. And just like that, the house transformed. No longer a residence but a crime scene. Yellow tape, controlled movement, officers separating rooms, documenting every detail, treating every surface like it might hold the answer to what had just happened. But even as investigators began their work inside, the suspect was already gone. According to police, Zachary Fuqua had fled the scene before officers fully secured the home. That detail alone changed everything about the response. What could have been contained as a single location crime quickly became a manhunt. Officers weren't just investigating anymore. They were searching. The urgency increased when investigators learned something else that made the case even more alarming. Children had been inside the home at the time of the shooting. At first, their condition wasn't fully clear to responders arriving at the scene. In chaotic situations like this, information comes in fragments, some of it accurate, some of it confused, all of it urgent. But what was consistent from early on was that minors had been present during the violence, and that alone intensified the emotional weight of the investigation for everyone involved. Inside the home, detectives began carefully reconstructing what they believed happened in the minutes leading up to Erica Sanders' death. Every room became a timeline. Every object became a clue. The kitchen, in particular, drew immediate attention from investigators, as that was where prosecutors would later say the fatal shooting occurred. Outside, patrol units began canvassing the surrounding streets. Officers moved from block to block, speaking to residents, checking cameras, and trying to trace the direction of the suspect's escape. The case had now split into two parallel investigations: what happened inside the house and where the suspect had gone after leaving it. It didn't take long before those two threads began to converge again. Police eventually located Fuqua near 10 Mile and Van Dyke, but by the time they closed in, the situation had already escalated from search to apprehension. Officers moved in and took him into custody without further incident, bringing an end to the immediate flight portion of the case, but not to the questions surrounding it. Back at the scene, investigators were still working through the aftermath. Detectives documented evidence, collected statements, and began building the initial framework of what would later become a formal charging narrative. In homicide investigations, the first hours are often the most critical, not because they provide all the answers, but because they preserve the conditions under which those answers can eventually be found. As daylight faded and the home remained sealed off, Erica Sanders' name began circulating through local reports. To her family and friends, she was not a case number or a headline. She was a mother, someone whose absence would now echo through her children's lives in a way that no investigation could immediately repair. But while the emotional reality of the case settled in, the legal machine was already moving forward. Fuqua was formally charged with second-degree murder and multiple weapons-related felonies. Prosecutors also noted a prior conviction that allegedly prohibited him from legally possessing a firearm, a detail that would later become part of the broader argument about how the situation escalated to this point. In court filings and early hearings, prosecutors laid out their initial theory of the case. They described a sudden, violent act inside the home. They alleged that Erica Sanders was shot in a manner consistent with an execution-style injury. They also emphasized the presence of children during the incident, a factor that added significant weight to how the case was being viewed legally and emotionally. But even in those early stages, one critical element remained missing from the public record: motive. No official explanation had been confirmed. No clear narrative had been established about what led to the fatal moment inside that home. And in cases like this, that absence often becomes its own kind of tension. When answers are not immediately available, speculation begins to fill the space where facts have not yet been fully uncovered. Meanwhile, Fuqua remained in custody as the court process began to unfold. His arraignment brought him face to face with the formal reality of the charges against him. Murder cases move slowly through the legal system, and at this stage, everything is still about allegations, not conclusions. But the severity of the accusations already painted a clear picture of how seriously prosecutors viewed the incident. Outside the courtroom, the community response was beginning to build. Residents expressed shock that such violence could erupt inside a quiet residential area. Neighbors who lived nearby described the usual rhythm of the street: normal, predictable, unremarkable, until it suddenly was. And then there were the children. Their presence during the incident became one of the most haunting details of the case. Investigators and prosecutors referenced them repeatedly, not only as witnesses in a legal sense, but as individuals who had experienced something no child should have to process. While officials did not immediately release detailed accounts of what they saw or heard, their involvement added another layer of urgency and gravity to the investigation. As detectives continued their work, they also began piecing together the relationship between Erica Sanders and Zachary Fuqua. Like many domestic cases, the outward appearance of a relationship can differ significantly from what occurs behind closed doors. However, in the early public record of this case, no definitive history explaining escalation or prior incidents was formally detailed by authorities at the time of initial charges. What remained clear was only what investigators could prove in court. A fatal shooting had occurred, and Fuqua was accused of being responsible. As days passed, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate crime scene. Detectives reviewed digital evidence, interviewed witnesses, and reconstructed timelines. Each piece of information helped refine the sequence of events, but the central question still lingered in the background like a shadow that had not yet been fully illuminated. What happened inside that home in the final moments before the shooting? For now, the answer remained locked within the evidence, the statements, and the ongoing legal process. And as the case moved from the chaos of the crime scene into the structure of the courtroom, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no longer just an investigation into a single violent act. It had become a story about what happens when a private relationship ends in a public tragedy, and how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into something irreversible. But the most important part of the story was still ahead. The early hours of the investigation had already painted a picture of shock and violence, but as detectives continued digging deeper into what happened inside that home, the case began to shift from a single moment of tragedy into something far more complex, something built on tension, movement, and decisions made in seconds that would permanently change multiple lives. By the time investigators had secured the scene in Center Line, the house where Erica Sanders was killed had become a sealed environment of questions. Every object inside was treated as potential evidence. Every room held fragments of a timeline that had to be rebuilt backwards, like trying to rewind something that was never meant to be seen in full. And in that process, one detail stood out more than others. The position of events suggested a sudden escalation. There was no indication of a long struggle spreading through the house, no extended confrontation moving room to room in the way some domestic violence cases unfold. Instead, investigators focused on what appeared to be a concentrated, decisive moment, one that happened quickly and ended just as fast. That conclusion, still part of an early theory at the time, would later become central to the charges brought forward in court. But outside the house, something equally important was unfolding: the movement of Zachary Fuqua after he left the scene. According to police, he did not remain in the immediate area. Instead, he fled, triggering a rapid response from officers who were now working under the assumption that a homicide suspect was on the move. This is the moment in any active case where urgency changes shape. It is no longer just about documenting what happened. It becomes about preventing what could happen next. Officers began spreading out across nearby roads, focusing on likely escape routes. Surveillance cameras from surrounding intersections became critical. Patrol units coordinated in real time, relaying updates as they attempted to narrow down Fuqua's location. And then the search tightened. Fuqua was eventually located near the intersection of 10 Mile Road and Van Dyke Avenue. But what happened in the moments leading up to his arrest was not described as a slow or controlled surrender. Instead, police reports indicated a brief but active effort to locate and secure him before the situation could escalate further. When officers finally took him into custody, the immediate danger phase of the incident came to an end. But in many ways, that moment marked the beginning of the legal battle rather than the conclusion of the investigation. Because now detectives had both halves of the story: what happened inside the home and who they believed was responsible. But even with a suspect in custody, the most important part of the investigation was still missing: the motive. In homicide cases, motive is not always required for charges, but it becomes essential for understanding. It is the piece that connects action to meaning. Without it, a case remains emotionally incomplete, even when legally strong. In early court proceedings, prosecutors did not immediately present a fully developed narrative explaining why the shooting occurred. Instead, they focused on what they could establish clearly: identity, location, cause of death, and the alleged sequence of events. They described Erica Sanders being shot in the home she lived in. They referenced the presence of children. They emphasized that Fuqua allegedly fled after the incident, and they introduced his prior legal history, particularly a conviction that reportedly prohibited him from possessing a firearm. Each of these details added weight to the prosecution's argument, but none of them fully explained intent. Meanwhile, the children who had been inside the home during the incident became a central but sensitive part of the investigation. Authorities were careful in how they handled their involvement publicly, but in cases like this, child witnesses often become both crucial sources of information and individuals in need of protection from the very process designed to uncover truth. Their accounts, whether spoken directly or gathered through interviews conducted by trained professionals, would help investigators understand what occurred in those final moments. But even then, such testimonies are usually fragmented, not because of dishonesty, but because traumatic events are rarely remembered in clean, linear detail. As the legal process moved forward, Fuqua's initial court appearances began to establish the formal structure of the case. He was charged with second-degree murder and multiple weapons offenses, signaling that prosecutors believed the act was intentional but not necessarily premeditated in the legal sense required for first-degree murder. This distinction matters significantly in court. Second-degree murder often implies intent or extreme recklessness without a fully planned execution. It allows prosecutors to argue that the act was deliberate, even if not carefully prearranged. At the same time, the weapons charges added another layer of seriousness. The allegation that Fuqua was a felon in possession of a firearm suggested that the presence of the weapon itself was illegal, independent of the shooting. As these legal arguments developed, the emotional reality outside the courtroom continued to unfold in silence. Erica Sanders' family was now left navigating not just grief, but the public nature of that grief. Her name had become part of official records, news reports, and legal filings, but to those who knew her personally, she remained someone far more complex than any document could capture. A mother, a daughter, a person whose absence would now be measured in milestones that would never come: birthdays, conversations, ordinary days that no longer included her voice. And in cases like this, time begins to behave differently. For investigators, it moves forward through procedure: reports, filings, hearings. For families, it moves in reverse, constantly returning to the moment everything changed. As more details slowly emerged, one thing became clear: the prosecution's case would rely heavily on establishing not just what happened, but how quickly it happened. The alleged shooting in the back of the head, the presence of children, and the immediate flight of the suspect were all being used to construct a narrative of sudden violence rather than prolonged conflict. But even that narrative, as strong as it appeared, would eventually be tested in court. Because every criminal case has two versions of the truth: the one presented by the state and the one challenged by the defense. And between those two versions lies the space where uncertainty lives. As Fuqua remained in custody, the case moved into its next phase: preliminary hearings, evidence review, and deeper forensic analysis of the scene. Detectives worked to finalize timelines, confirming exactly when events occurred and how quickly emergency response was triggered. Each new piece of information either reinforced the initial theory or forced investigators to refine it. That is the nature of homicide investigations. They evolve, not in leaps, but in constant adjustments. And through all of it, one fact remained unchanged. Erica Sanders was gone. The rest of the case, arrests, charges, legal arguments, and court appearances, was built around understanding how that single reality came to be. But as the investigation deepened and the courtroom preparation intensified, a larger question began to take shape in the background, one that would soon define the emotional weight of the entire case. How does something so violent unfold inside what should have been a safe home? And what warning signs, if any, existed before it reached its final, irreversible moment? That question would not be answered in the early stages. It would wait, because the next phase of the story was not about what investigators had already found. It was about what the trial would eventually reveal. As the case moved into its final stage before trial, the courtroom atmosphere began to shift. What had once been a fast-moving investigation, sirens, searches, and sealed-off streets, was now transforming into something slower, more controlled, and far more deliberate. Every word mattered. Every piece of evidence had to survive scrutiny. And every detail about that Tuesday evening in Center Line, Michigan, was now being weighed not in urgency, but in judgment. Inside the courtroom, the story of Erica Sanders' final moments was no longer being told by investigators racing against time. It was being reconstructed piece by piece through testimony, reports, and physical evidence, each side attempting to shape the meaning of what happened inside that home. For the prosecution, the narrative remained consistent. They described a sudden and fatal shooting inside the residence, with Erica Sanders allegedly struck in a way that suggested immediate incapacitation. They emphasized that children were present in the home, making the circumstances not only violent, but deeply traumatic for those who witnessed it. And they reinforced their claim that Zachary Fuqua fled the scene immediately afterward, turning what happened inside into a broader manhunt across multiple locations. But in court, repetition alone is not enough. Every claim must be anchored in proof. So prosecutors leaned heavily on the physical evidence collected from the home. Forensic analysis of the scene, combined with the medical examiner's findings, helped establish the cause of death and the nature of the injury. Investigators also relied on witness statements, including accounts from those who were inside the home during the incident, to build a timeline that placed Fuqua at the center of the event. The prosecution's argument was not just about what happened, it was about the speed and certainty of what allegedly occurred. They wanted the jury and the public to understand this as a moment of sudden violence, not a prolonged confrontation or accidental tragedy. And then there was the detail that prosecutors repeatedly returned to because of its emotional weight: the children. Their presence during the shooting added a dimension that no legal charge could fully capture. In court filings and statements, prosecutors described how the environment inside the home was not isolated or empty at the time of the incident. It was occupied, it was lived in, and it included minors who were forced into proximity with a moment of lethal violence. The emotional impact of that detail lingered in every retelling of the case. But as always in the justice system, the prosecution's version was only one side. The defense, while not disputing that a death occurred or that Fuqua was present, worked to challenge interpretation, intent, and the certainty of the narrative being presented. In cases like this, the defense does not need to prove innocence in the same way the prosecution must prove guilt. Instead, they focus on creating doubt, about intent, about sequence, about the reliability of perception in chaotic moments. Was the act intentional in the way prosecutors described? Was the sequence of events as clear-cut as it appeared? Was there context that had not yet been fully explored? These are the kinds of questions that begin to shape a courtroom battle once the investigation phase ends. Fuqua's prior record also became part of the legal discussion. Prosecutors highlighted his previous conviction that allegedly barred him from possessing a firearm, using it to support their argument that his actions were not only violent but also illegal on multiple levels. The defense, however, would typically seek to limit how much weight such history carries in determining guilt for the specific act being tried. Meanwhile, outside the legal arguments, the reality for Erica Sanders' family remained unchanged and irreversible. No testimony, no cross-examination, and no verdict could bring her back. The courtroom could only attempt to define accountability, not repair loss. For those following the case, the emotional divide became increasingly clear. On one side, a structured legal process working to determine responsibility. On the other, a human tragedy that could not be reduced to statutes and charges alone. And at the center of it, all were the unanswered questions that continued to linger even as the case progressed. What triggered the fatal moment inside that home? Was there a warning that no one saw in time? Or did it happen, as prosecutors suggested, in a sudden escalation that left no opportunity for intervention? As the proceedings continued, investigators and attorneys alike revisited the timeline again and again, tightening it, refining it, and preparing it for the moment it would be presented to a jury in its most complete form. But even the most detailed timeline has its limits. Because a timeline can show when something happened and where it happened, but it cannot always fully explain why. And that why is what everyone in the courtroom was ultimately searching for. By the time Fuqua's case reached its critical stages, the story of Erica Sanders had already become something larger than a single incident. It had become part of a broader conversation about domestic violence, about escalation inside relationships, and about how quickly private conflict can turn into public tragedy. But for those closest to her, it was not a case study. It was a life interrupted. A home that would never feel the same again. Children who would carry memories no child should have to carry. And a name that would now be spoken in courtrooms instead of living rooms. As the judge prepared for the next phase of proceedings, one final reality settled over the case. Everything that could be investigated had been examined. Everything that could be charged had been filed. Everything that could be argued was being prepared. What remained was the moment when all of it would be placed before a jury, and the story of that Tuesday evening would be reduced to a single question of law. Guilty or not guilty? And whatever answer came next would define how the final chapter of Zachary Fuqua's case would be written. But it would never change the ending of Erica Sanders' story.